Resident Evil 4 is perhaps the most highly anticipated remake of the year. It's not hard to see why. It promises a full redesign of a highly decorated game with a ton of new content and reworked mechanics. It's an excellent looking title as well, with fine-grained indirect lighting and attractive artwork as John covered in his earlier video. But recent Resident Evil titles have suffered from awkward configurations on consoles, with uncapped frame rates and unimpressive ray tracing support. The RE engine itself is powerful enough, but implementation hangups have dragged down certain games from a technical perspective. So is Resident Evil 4 a step up from those prior efforts, or does it repeat the sins of the past? Resident Evil 4 is a very technically dense game with a lot of interesting and bizarre technical minutiae, so I'm going to keep it brisk. I've limited my capture to the first few hours of the game, but there will still be some minor location spoilers for early content. All current gen consoles pack a framerate mode and a resolution mode, plus some other toggles that we'll discuss shortly. Both options target 60 FPS, but image quality differs quite a bit, and not really in the ways that you'd expect. Series X, for its part, is pretty well behaved here. The framerate mode hits roughly 1800p, and the resolution mode comes in at 2160p. The game does appear to use a form of reconstruction to hit that output, very likely checkerboarding based on the game's artifact patterns and the use of the technique in recent RE engine games. The resolution mode is a bit clearer, though both hold up pretty similarly at a typical viewing distance, especially given the dark and low contrast game content, which tends to suit a less precise look just fine. The PS5 looks substantially blurrier in head-to-heads relative to Series X, although curiously, pixel counts in framerate mode actually seem higher, coming in at around 1944p, while the resolution mode clocks in at the same 2160p, both with checkerboarding. Across opaque surfaces, the game has a slightly smeary representation of fine detail across both visual modes. More concerning though is the breakup on transparencies. When Leon's hair is moving, for instance, it has an aliased half-resolution look, while Series X stays relatively coherent and free of jagged edges. I think something is up with the checkerboarding on PS5 that is creating issues here. Any scene with foliage is just a bit of a noisy mess, and SSAO shimmers quite a bit as well. It's not uniformly bad, to be fair, and a lot of scenes look perfectly fine. It's really just the resolve on transparent elements that is troubling here. That becomes especially clear when we look at Xbox Series S. Despite rendering at lower resolutions, a 1080p resolution in framerate mode, with a 1440p pixel count in resolution mode, again with what looks like a checkerboard reconstruction, Series S has about the same amount of aliasing on fine transparencies like hair as the PS5 release. Outside of image quality, there are a handful of odd differences that separate these modes. Series S takes a hit in texture quality in spots, which seems fairly minor in most instances, but it otherwise looks fine considering the hardware. Resident Evil 4 on current-gen consoles uses a mix of cube map and screen space reflections to represent reflection detail by default. The SSR is drawn all the way to the bottom of the screen, occlusion issues be damned, and there's often a big difference in color between the SSR and the underlying cube map. But if you turn on the resolution mode on Series X or PS5 and keep ray tracing turned off, the SSR no longer seems to be present. It's a baffling issue. To be honest, the artifact-ridden, low-quality RE engine SSR probably detracts from the visuals more than it helps, so I'd prefer that it was removed entirely from the game on consoles. Series S does something unique here though, and we'll touch on that in a moment. Finally, there is an option for lens distortion with chromatic aberration, which softens and distorts the image on all platforms and is enabled by default. I'd advise turning this off regardless of the platform you're playing on, and the footage in this video was captured with the effect off, but PS5 seems particularly heavily affected, with an especially soft resolve. Then there are two additional options on PS5 and Series X, an option to enable strand-based hair, plus an option to enable ray tracing, bringing those consoles to an effective total of 8 visual modes. The hair strands option should really be skipped over in my opinion. The card-based hair used by default actually has a more detailed appearance, and is more realistically shaded with a glossy look that suits Leon's smooth straight hair. The strand-based hair has a matte appearance instead, which feels less plausible given his hair characteristics and does clash with representations of Leon in other media. It can also suffer from odd lighting in some circumstances, as it often looks too bright. If you look closely, the hair cards have more limited and uniform movement than the strand-based hair, but otherwise I actually think it's a visual downgrade. Ray tracing in contrast does improve the game's presentation, though it's not a slam dunk win. Unlike recent Resident Evil titles, this option appears to only offer RT reflections, which tends to have a limited impact on the overall visuals. Bodies of water do tend to look more realistic, though I did notice some off-putting issues occasionally at a distance. The effect appears to render at a low resolution and is only enabled on a very limited number of surfaces. I actually couldn't spot its use anywhere in the early game, except on water surfaces. Series S doesn't seem to feature either the hair strands or ray tracing graphical options, as neither are noted in the game's menu. But turning on the resolution mode does toggle on ray traced reflections, albeit at a very low resolution, with no toggle to turn it off. Again, Resident Evil 4 is just chock full of strange and undocumented visual issues. So what about performance? Essentially, Resident Evil 4 operates on a sliding scale, with frame rates dropping further the more visual options that you pile on. For instance, on Series X the framerate mode runs this shot at 60 FPS, but as we toggle additional visual options, first turning on RT and hair strands and then switching to resolution mode and doing the same, the framerate dives. The game essentially operates with unlocked performance if you run it with anything but the default framerate mode with no options toggled. That's not to say that the default mode is perfect. The game frequently drops frames, particularly in larger fights like the demanding village encounter towards the start of the game. It's mostly 60 FPS, but the drops are intrusive. Resolution mode basically runs uniformly worse, often hitting frame rates in the low to mid 40s, while turning everything on will degrade performance to the mid 30s at worst in tougher shots. It's a pretty unimpressive turnout, and there's no framerate cap at all to engage to keep things consistent. PS5 is much the same, but the overall framerate is higher. The village fight only suffers a few significant drops in the framerate mode, for instance. The resolution mode bottoms out in the high 40s, and the all-dressed option hits the low 40s. So it's not great, but it is a noticeably better performer. Series S runs worse than either of the two premium machines. The framerate mode spends extended periods between 50 and 60 FPS, and the resolution mode bottoms out in the low 30s, although this mode on Series S packs RT as well, as I mentioned earlier. There's only 2 modes here, not the 8 modes of the other platforms, though only the framerate mode feels okay in typical gameplay. So my recommendation for most players would be to stick with the default framerate mode on current gen machines, perhaps toggling ray tracing on or moving to resolution mode if you have a VRR display and are fine with slightly lower performance. Xbox players have a bit more latitude to push visual fidelity given the console's larger VRR window at 120Hz output, but those options still come at a noticeable cost to fluidity. I'm not really happy with the performance on display here or the complicated visual options, which should probably have been simplified to a 60 FPS mode and a 30 FPS mode with additional resolution and visual features. The game just doesn't have a very console-like configuration in its current state. Plus, performance in the framerate mode on PS5 and Series X is still below expectations, and Series S suffers further still. Even if Capcom doesn't untangle the mess of visual options here, they should tackle the framerate problems that plague even the game's fastest running configurations. Plus, I did notice some occasional visual bugs, like issues with the water surface and some oddly lit textures, both of which popped up on Series X in my testing. Resident Evil 4 also suffers from issues with controller response on Xbox, as the series consoles have an absolutely massive dead zone that makes the game feel strange and sluggish. I have to push the right stick about 40% through its range of motion here to get any feedback on screen whatsoever, whereas on PS5, I barely have to deflect it at all to get a response. Neither platform feels perfect and the game has a slightly laggy feel in general, but the series machines seem to have a big configuration issue on top of that. Despite my complaints about the way Resident Evil 4 has been delivered, there's no doubt that it's an excellent looking title, which did leave me in doubt about last-gen consoles. Plus, Capcom is only shipping the game on PS4 and PS4 Pro, skipping the Xbox One platforms, perhaps owing to performance concerns. So can the base PS4 really deliver this level of visual complexity in a cross-gen game? It's a bit complicated. On the one hand, the basic visual feature set seems fairly close. Just running around the game world, everything looks about as it should. It's actually an impressive effort on PS4 when taken on the whole, with solid visuals considering its cross-gen origins. But on closer inspection, there are some visual issues. Firstly, texture resolution has been cut down across the board, with much lower res artwork on PS4. Most surfaces look quite a bit less detailed on the last-gen machine. Texture streaming also suffers on PS4. It often takes about 10 seconds for high-resolution texture assets to swap in, with low-resolution placeholders for that duration. Even when the final assets are in place, the results aren't that great of course, but it does seem like the PS4's limited CPU and storage resources are throwing up some unexpected issues here. Lighting also gets a bit of a downgrade. Indirectly lit scenes sometimes look very different with less detailed GI, which is especially noticeable outdoors. I did notice that dynamic lights sometimes didn't cast shadows on PS4 in places where current-gen consoles do exhibit shadows. Although not all light sources are shadow casting on the more powerful machines either. There also doesn't seem to be any screen space reflections on PS4, and subsurface scattering is absent as well. Foliage on PS4 is static and doesn't seem to bend with the movement of the wind at all. Current-gen platforms have effective, if often subtle, foliage animation that is completely absent on PS4, which does stick out sometimes in the outdoor game areas. Enemies also suffer from animation issues, with foes at a distance running at reduced animation rates. The opening village fight is a good example, with a heavy use of half-rate animation. This was a common concession in prior Resident Evil games on consoles, but it seems especially obvious here. Finally, resolution gets cut back to 1600 by 900 in the PS4's sole visual mode, though it doesn't seem to use reconstruction. Image quality is surprisingly respectable as a result, with a pretty reasonable resolve on fine details. PS4 Pro is comparable to PS4 with similar visual cutbacks. Pixel counts clock in at about 972p in the framerate mode, though the resolution mode seems to get bumped up to a full 4K checkerboard. The resolution mode also gets somewhat denser foliage, though this is only really noticeable in side-by-sides. PS4 has an unlocked frame rate, just like the other versions of the game. The general run of play operates between 35 and 50 FPS, so it tends to feel very unstable. PS4 Pro's framerate mode is usually 60 FPS, but it does drop in heavier moments, which is similar to the Series X, I would say. But PS4 Pro's resolution mode is the worst performer of them all. The game is often hugging 30 FPS, with occasional dips to the 20s. So PS4 consoles definitely hand in a substantially compromised Resident Evil 4 experience. But the game is still playable and it's attractive enough on its own terms. Resident Evil 4 is an excellent game and a very good looking title that is unfortunately held back by issues with the basic game configuration. All of the issues from prior RE Engine console games seem to have returned here, alongside a convoluted set of visual options and other problems. Expect to see reconstruction artifacts, sub 60 FPS performance with no 30 FPS cap option, visual glitches, a strand-based hair option that looks worse than the default, serious image quality issues on PS5, very limited ray tracing, poor and inconsistent option documentation, ugly screen space reflections, and controller response problems in addition to other concerns. It really feels like the game is missing a few thorough QA passes, as these are problems that we wouldn't really expect to see in a cross-gen game running on current-gen consoles. Resident Evil 4 is a solid game, and there is a lot of visual accomplishment on display here. It's just a shame that there are so many smaller issues, many of them completely unexpected and very strange, that dampen the overall experience. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.